The mountain didn't welcome strangers, it tested them. Elias Ward wasn't looking for redemption when he came home, but the moment his hand touched that cabin door, something ancient began to stir. He could feel it in the floor, in the wood, in the quiet spaces where memory still breathed. By the time he discovered what his family had hidden, it was too late to turn back. The truth was waiting, loyal and alive. Stay with this story until the end, and you'll understand what can survive even death. Like, subscribe and share where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Elias Ward had always believed silence was a kind of safety. After years of city noise and heartbreak, after funerals where sympathy felt rehearsed, and after doors closed behind people who didn't know how to stay, silence was all he had left. The drive into the Blue Ridge was long 9 hours of winding roads and memories he didn't want, but couldn't shake. When he finally reached the last turn, headlights swept across an old wooden mailbox barely clinging to its post. H. Ward, 1945. The cabin stood at the edge of a pine hollow, small and dark against the mountain sky, a place his mother had once called the only home your grandfather ever trusted. He parked the truck, listening to the engines ticking fade into the cold night. Beside him, Bram, his aging German shepherd, raised his head. One ear flopped, one scarred from a fight long ago. The dog's eyes, cloudy but warm, watched the cabin like it was something alive. Elias's own reflection in the truck window looked worn, 42. Black, quiet, tired. His hands were those of a woodworker, calloused from years of shaping things that lasted longer than love. He took a deep breath, stepped out, and for a moment the air smelled like his childhood oak smoke, damp soil and rain waiting somewhere unseen. The porch creaked under his boots. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "Wood talks, Eli. You just gotta listen." When he pushed open the door, it groaned like an old man stretching his bones after a long sleep. Inside, dust floated in the faint light of his flashlight, and the air carried a faint sweetness, pipe tobacco and pine resin, a scent that wrapped itself around memory. He walked slowly, his boots stirring the quiet. The furniture was still there. The rocking chair, the stone fireplace, the thick Bible on the shelf open to a psalm his grandfather had loved. Bram padded beside him, sniffing corners as though checking for ghosts. "Home," Elias murmured, though it didn't quite feel like it yet. He built a fire. The flames flared, pushing shadows back into the walls. The light danced across carvings, tiny symbols etched into the beams. He remembered tracing those shapes as a child, while his grandfather told stories about the listening cabin. Back then, he thought it was just a tale meant to make him behave. But now, standing there with grief still raw and heavy, he wasn't so sure. The storm outside rolled closer, low thunder like distant drums. Bram had begun pacing. His claws clicked softly on the floorboards near the hearth. He sniffed one spot, then scratched, circling it once before whining. "Easy boy," Elias said, crouching down. The board under Bram's paw gave a faint hollow echo. He pressed his palm against it. There was warmth there, not from the fire, but deeper, almost pulsing. His hand trembled. "Must be a draft," he whispered. But even as he said it, the lie didn't settle. He leaned closer until his ear brushed the wood. Beneath the floor, faint but real, came a rhythm. A heartbeat. He pulled back fast, staring at the spot. Bram watched him, silent now, tail low, but not afraid. Elias felt the old cabin hum just once, like a sigh released after decades. He sat down beside his dog, uncertain whether to laugh or pray. He could hear the rain outside, now soft and steady, and in it, the heartbeats echo. The sound wasn't threatening. It was gentle, measured, as though the mountain itself was breathing. He whispered, "Guess you still remember me, huh?" The flames flickered. Somewhere in the rafters, something settled with a crack, like a nod. For a moment, Elias imagined his grandfather standing in the doorway, pipe in hand, smiling with that quiet pride that said nothing but meant everything. He blinked hard, and the image was gone. He poured Bram some water from an old tin bowl and sat cross-legged on the floor. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked softly. Bram let out a low hum of agreement before lying down, his head resting exactly over that same spot. Elias stared into the fire, trying to steady his breathing. Maybe grief was making him hear things. Maybe the cabin was just old wood, remembering footsteps that had worn it down. But in his bones, he felt something else, something watchful. The longer he sat there, the clearer the rhythm beneath him became, not constant like machinery, but irregular, alive. Thunder cracked. The wind howled, rattling the windows. For the first time in months, Elias wasn't thinking about death or regret. He was listening to wood, to rain, to time itself. Every creak in the cabin felt deliberate, like words in a forgotten language. His grandfather had once said, "This house don't keep secrets, it keeps promises." Elias hadn't understood it then. Morning crept into the cabin, slow and pale, brushing light across the dusty windows. Elias woke to the sound of Bram scratching again at the same board near the hearth, his tail sweeping the floor in short, urgent arcs. The fire had burned down to ash, and the faint warmth beneath the wood was gone, replaced by an almost expectant chill. For a long moment, Elias just watched his dog, the way his ears twitched, the way he pressed one paw firmly onto the plank, as if demanding action. "All right," Elias muttered, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You win." He pushed the coffee pot onto the small stove, but his attention never left that spot. The old cabin was quiet, except for Bram's breathing and the wind that whistled through the chinks in the logs. When he knelt and pressed his hand to the wood, he felt it again, less like a heartbeat. This time more like the faint pulse of air from below. He traced the edges of the plank and found small nails, each rusted thin with time. Whoever built this had meant for it to stay hidden, but not forever. He reached for his pocket knife and pried gently. The board lifted with a tired sigh, releasing a puff of stale air and the faint scent of earth and oil. Bram whined, backing up, nose twitching. Beneath the floor lay a shallow compartment lined with old burlap. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was something small and heavy. Elias unrolled it carefully and found a brass key, simple, worn smooth from use, its teeth dulled. Beside it, tied in twine, was a leather collar cracked with age. The tag on it read, Harlan 1942. The name meant nothing to him at first, but the year struck him. His grandfather had fought in the war then. Elias turned the collar in his hands. The stitching was handmade, the kind his grandfather might have done himself. The metal tag was bent slightly, as if once gripped too hard. Bram sniffed it, then whimpered, backing away. "You know something, don't you?" Elias whispered. He reached deeper and found a folded paper tucked under the cloth. His pulse quickened as he unfolded it. The ink had faded, but the handwriting, firm and looped, was unmistakable. Henry Ward, his grandfather. The first line read, "To whoever finds this, keep the door open for those who come after." The words made his throat tighten. He read on, "If you found this key, it means the mountain still remembers. It means the promise still stands. The door beneath must never be sealed for fear or shame. Keep it open, boy, for those who come hungry, tired, or afraid. The Lord's house was built for all his children, not just the ones who look like us." Elias stopped there. His grandfather had written that at a time when few men in this valley dared speak such words aloud. He could almost hear the voice again, rough, quiet, defiant. He read the last line softly. "Forgive me if I couldn't carry it to the end. Every man leaves some work unfinished." He sat back on his heels, staring at the collar and the key. The fire hissed as a gust of wind pressed against the cabin, and for a moment the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Bram nudged Elias's shoulder and then looked toward the hearth again. Elias followed his gaze. The faint outline of a square seam, almost invisible, before caught the morning light. There was more hidden below, something deeper. He touched the edge with his fingers and felt stone beneath wood. "You kept secrets, old man," he murmured, half smiling through the heaviness in his chest. He set the key on the mantel beside his grandfather's Bible. The brass gleamed faintly, catching a beam of sun that filtered through the window. Something about it felt alive, almost humming under his skin. He sat for a long time, the letter in his lap, thinking about what it meant to keep the door open. Maybe it was a metaphor, some moral lesson about kindness. Or maybe his grandfather had meant it literally. He'd always been a man who believed faith should have hands and purpose. Elias remembered stories his mother told about how his grandfather had taken in strangers, fed travelers who passed through after the war, how some neighbors called him too trusting for his own good. She'd said it like a flaw, but Elias now wondered if it was the truest thing about him. Outside, clouds gathered again, and the wind carried the scent of rain. Bram stood near the door, tail-stiff eyes fixed on something unseen. Elias followed, stepping onto the porch. The mountains were swallowed in mist. Somewhere below the creek murmured steady and endless. He looked back at the cabin, the key gleaming faintly behind the glass window, and felt the weight of something old and unfinished pressing against his ribs. When he came back inside, he picked up the collar again. Harlan, he whispered, tracing the letters. Maybe it had belonged to a dog his grandfather once owned. Maybe to someone else entirely. Either way, the name felt important, like an echo of something that hadn't yet ended. He slipped the collar into his coat pocket, the key into the other. Bram watched him with quiet eyes, patient and knowing. Elias poured coffee into a tin cup, sat near the fire, and read the letter one last time. Keep the door open. It felt less like instruction and more like inheritance. His grandfather hadn't been asking. He'd been passing something on. The cabin groaned softly as the wind pressed against it again. Elias leaned back, the warmth of the fire brushing his face. He thought of his mother's last words, "Go where the roots remember you." Maybe this was what she'd meant. Rain returned that evening, not as a storm, but as a steady whisper that slipped through the trees and soaked the mountain in silver mist. Elias sat by the fire again. The letter unfolded beside him on the table. He had read it at least 10 times that day, tracing every shaky line of his grandfather's handwriting, memorizing the pauses where the ink bled deeper, as though the old man's heart had pressed too hard. Bram lay near the hearth, breathing slow, his body angled toward the same floorboard where the heartbeat had once thudded. The collar lay beside the key on the mantel now, both of them gleaming faintly in the flicker of firelight. The house seemed different since he opened that compartment. The air moved slower, like it was listening again. He poured himself a cup of coffee, gone cold, and leaned back, staring into the flames. His grandfather's words echoed in his head that keep the door open for those who come after. The phrase wouldn't let him rest. What door? And who had come before? His thoughts churned until Bram lifted his head, growling low. The dog's ears pricked toward the far wall where shadows pooled thick. Elias followed his gaze. The wallboards there were darker than the others, warped slightly near the base. He stood, grabbed his flashlight, and crossed the room. The boards looked solid, but the edges didn't quite line up with the rest. He tapped one with the handle of his knife, hollow. He pried at the seam, careful not to splinter the wood, when the first board loosened dust and cold air spilled through. Behind it was another layer stone, rough and uneven. The beam of his light caught something scratched into it. He wiped away the dust, and letters appeared, carved deep and deliberate. "Deliver us through the night." Beneath it were 6 sets of initials, uneven, hurried. Elias's breath caught. These weren't markings left by builders. These were prayers. He crouched, tracing the grooves with his fingers. The edges were smooth, worn by time, as if touched by many hands. He felt the weight of them in his chest. "You were hiding people," he whispered, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. The realization came slow and heavy. The cabin hadn't been just a home. It had been a sanctuary. Bram whined softly behind him as though understanding. Elias sat back, his heart hammering. The history his family had carried wasn't written in any book. It was carved into the very bones of this place. His grandfather hadn't built a retreat. He had built a refuge. He remembered something his mother had said once when he was a boy, her voice low and cautious. Your granddaddy kept his faith where nobody could burn it. Back then, he thought she'd meant it as a metaphor. Now he knew it was literal. He turned the flashlight deeper into the gap and saw the faint outline of a narrow tunnel leading downward, sealed by what looked like an old trap door half buried under dirt and stone. The door handle was gone, but a small ring of brass remained snapped clean. Elias's pulse quickened. The letter's words, "Keep the door open," suddenly carried more weight than metaphor. His grandfather had risked everything to give others a chance to live. Black soldiers, freedmen, people hunted for the color of their skin, the same color Elias carried in his own. For a long time, he just sat there in the quiet, staring at that hidden door. The air seemed to hum with the ghost of footsteps. He imagined men huddled in the dark beneath his feet, clutching one another's hands, whispering prayers to a God who might not answer. He could almost hear them breathing, smell the sweat, and fear the hope and desperation. A knot formed in his throat. "You did good, old man," he murmured, voice breaking. He thought of how dangerous it would have been then for a black man to hide others, to defy the laws that hunted his own people. It wasn't courage for glory. It was courage born of conviction, the kind passed down in silence, the kind that built homes like this. Bram nudged his elbow, snapping him out of his thoughts. The dog's tail flicked once eyes soft. Elias smiled faintly. "Guess we're standing on holy ground, huh?" He rose, grabbed a crowbar from beside the door, and worked at the lower stones until the latch beneath the wall gave way with a groan. The old hinges protested, but finally opened enough for him to glimpse what lay beyond. A small space, maybe 6 feet square, lined with stone. Inside, a single wooden crate, half collapsed, sat in the corner. He dragged it out, coughing, as dust filled the air. The lid came off with one pull, revealing folded blankets, a tin cup, and an old army canteen. Beneath those, wrapped in cloth, was a framed photograph. He wiped it clean. His grandfather stood at the edge of the porch, hat in hand, surrounded by 6 men in worn uniforms, their faces proud and unflinching. One of them held a shepherd dog, lean and sharp-eyed. The back of the photo bore handwriting faded almost to invisibility. "May the door always stay open. 1944. Elias stared until his eyes blurred. His grandfather had kept their secret, and the mountain had kept his. Bram sat beside him, staring at the photograph, tail brushing the floor. The dog's reflection flickered in the glass, overlapping with that of the shepherd in the picture. For a heartbeat, Elias swore the 2 images matched perfectly. He set the frame carefully on the mantel beside the collar. The air in the cabin seemed to ease, like the house was grateful to be remembered. He returned to the open wall and placed his hand on the rough stone. Night sank into the valley like smoke, and the mountain wind carried a soft whistle through the trees, the same kind of sound that came before revelation. Elias couldn't shake the weight of what he had seen the photograph, the carvings, the sealed wall that had guarded history beneath his feet. He sat awake for hours with Bram sleeping at his boots, the photograph on the mantel, catching each flicker of firelight. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the floor, toward the faint square of boards that felt different from the rest. The heartbeat he'd heard 2 nights ago was gone, now replaced by something quieter, an invitation. Around midnight, he finally stood. He grabbed his flashlight, his crowbar, and his courage, then moved to the spot near the hearth where Bram had scratched before. The dog rose without being called, his cloudy eyes alert, his tail low but steady. Elias ran his hand across the plank seams until he felt one with the tiniest give. "All right, boy," he said softly. "Let's see what they left for us." He wedged the crowbar into the gap and leaned his weight. The wood groaned, reluctant but not resistant, and after a moment, the board lifted. The air that rushed out was cold stale and smelled faintly of earth iron and candle smoke long gone. Beneath lay a black void and a narrow set of steps descending into the stone foundation. Elias shone his light down the beam, cutting through a cloud of dust that swirled like ghosts disturbed from rest. The steps looked stable, but narrow, carved by hand. Bram whimpered, then barked once a short, sharp sound, as if urging him forward. "You're braver than me," Elias muttered, taking the first step. The wood creaked beneath his weight, echoing through the hollow below. Each step seemed to take him deeper into time. The smell of old air thickened heavy with memory. When his boots touched the ground, he found himself in a small stone chamber, maybe 10 feet across. Walls slick with age. He swept the flashlight around. Against one wall, 2 rusted cot frames leaned together, their thin mattresses long decayed. In the corner sat a small table with a tin mug still standing upright, its rim stained brown with rust and time. On the table lay a Bible, its pages curled but intact. Elias brushed off the dust. The book was open to Psalm 91, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." He whispered the verse aloud, his voice trembling in the hollow air. The echo of it filled the room like prayer. Bram paced slowly near the stairs, sniffing at the corners, his ears twitching toward the far wall. The beam of the flashlight followed him and caught something faint etched into the stone near the floor. Elias knelt, wiped away the grime, and read the words carved in a shaky hand. "If you're reading this, we made it." He stared at it for a long moment, his throat tightening. Those men, the ones in the photograph, had written their triumph into the stone, a message for whoever came, after proof that faith had carried them beyond fear. Elias's hands trembled as he touched the letters, tracing the grooves left by someone who had believed in tomorrow. The tears came before he could stop them. They weren't loud, just quiet streams cutting through dust and years. He sat down on the cold floor, the Bible still open beside him, the air around him thick with gratitude and grief. "You made it," he whispered, voice breaking, "and you left a door for the rest of us." Bram came close, pressing his head into Elias's shoulder, his body warm and grounding. For a moment, man and dog sat there together, 2 living things inside a room built for survival, bound by memory. They hadn't lived, but somehow understood. The longer he sat there, the more alive the space felt. It wasn't haunted, it was hallowed. Elias imagined the nights his grandfather must have sat here, listening to footsteps overhead, the crack of branches, the whisper of danger. Maybe he'd prayed the same psalm that lay open now, his faith heavy but unbroken. Elias picked up the mug from the table and ran his thumb along the rim. He could almost see a hand gripping it decades ago, trembling from exhaustion or hope. He found a rusted lantern half buried in the dirt and lifted it, its handle crumbling in his grasp. Everything in this room had outlasted fear. He looked around and noticed faint marks near the ceiling lines, drawn in chalk tally marks, maybe to count nights spent hidden. There were at least 30 of them. 30 nights in darkness, 30 nights alive. He turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, letting the silence speak. It wasn't empty. It breathed. The wind above whispered through the cracks, and the house seemed to shift gently, as if acknowledging his presence. "I see it now," Grandpa Elias said softly. "You didn't build a hiding place. You built a promise." Bram let out a soft rumble curling at his feet. Elias sat there for a long time, until the chill began to bite through his jacket. Before climbing back up, he reached for the Bible, turning one page at random. A pressed leaf fell from the fold, oak, brittle, but still whole. On it in faint pencil, someone had written a single word, "home." Elias stared at it, his chest aching. He placed the leaf back where it belonged and closed the book gently. "You're home now," he whispered. The The morning after his descent into the secret room, Elias woke before dawn to the sound of wind sifting through the chimney. The fire had gone cold, but the cabin still held warmth, as if the stories sleeping beneath its floor continued to burn on their own. Bram lay near the door, ears twitching even in sleep. Outside, the mountains were shrouded in fog, thick as smoke, swallowing the ridgeline into silence. Elias moved quietly, pouring water into the coffee pot and lighting the stove. Every movement felt reverent now, like walking inside a church built from his own bloodline. The memory of the hidden chamber pressed on his mind, the rusted beds the leaf marked, home the carved words that declared victory over fear. Yet something else lingered too, a sense of unfinished business, as if the mountain had one more truth waiting. When he looked at Bram, who was now awake and watching him with those steady brown eyes, he understood the story wasn't done. "All right, boy," Elias said softly. "Let's go back down once more." He opened the floor and descended into the hollow again, flashlight cutting through the still air. The room greeted him like an old friend, silent but full. He sat on the dirt floor, tracing the edges of the stone wall where the carvings lived. That's when he noticed at a corner where the dirt seemed disturbed, faintly smoother than the rest. He brushed it with his boot and hit something hard. Kneeling, he dug with his hands until his fingers hit the edge of a box smaller than the crate from before. Its surface was smooth wood, sealed with a nail that had almost rusted through. With a few taps from the crowbar, it opened, revealing a stack of papers bound in twine, a folded American flag, and at the very bottom, an envelope sealed with wax that bore the initials HW. His heartbeat quickened. He broke the seal and pulled out a single photograph. Its edges curled its image ghostly but clear. 7 men stood in front of the cabin. 6 young black soldiers in worn uniforms, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, and beside them, a tall man in overalls and a weathered hat, his grandfather. Between them sat a shepherd dog, proud and alert, with markings almost identical to Bram's. Elias stared, breath locked in his throat. The faces of the men in the picture were lined with exhaustion, but alive with something brighter, hope, maybe pride. They weren't hiding in fear. They were standing in triumph. On the back of the photo, written in his grandfather's hand, were the words, "Guardians don't always walk on 2 legs." Elias closed his eyes and let the weight of it wash over him. The realization struck sharp and gentle, all at once. Bram wasn't just his dog. He was part of a legacy that stretched through generations of watchful eyes and faithful hearts. Somewhere in the bloodline of the shepherd, there was another who had stood guard while the hunted men slept. He looked at Bram, who had followed him down into the chamber, sitting now exactly where the old dog in the photo had once sat. The resemblance was uncanny, eerie in its perfection. The same slope of the ears, the same intelligent calm. "You've been guarding this place longer than I ever knew," Elias whispered, his voice breaking halfway through. Bram tilted his head as though listening to ghosts. The air thickened warm, and for a heartbeat, Elias could almost hear breathing that wasn't his own. He felt surrounded by presence, the soldiers his grandfather, the dogs that had watched them all. They were here not as hauntings, but as witnesses. He picked up the folded flag, its colors dulled but intact, and laid it over his lap. The cloth felt alive beneath his fingers. The soldiers in the photo had likely fought for a country that didn't love them, had hidden in a world that feared them, yet still had believed enough in goodness to carve words of hope into stone. His grandfather had sheltered them, fed them, risked his life for them, and somehow passed down that duty to his grandson and a shepherd who wouldn't stop scratching at the floor. "You kept them safe," Elias said quietly. "And now you're keeping me." He tucked the photograph carefully into his jacket pocket and rose to his feet. The chamber didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt lighter, almost breathing again. When he climbed the stairs back into the cabin, sunlight had begun to push through the fog, spilling gold across the walls. Bram followed his paws soft on the wood. Elias placed the photo on the mantel beside the Bible, the collar, and the key. Together they looked like a shrine, not of worship, but of remembrance. He poured coffee into a cup and sat down, staring at the photo in the morning light. The men's faces seemed to shift subtly in the flame's reflection, alive again. He could almost hear laughter in the crackle of the fire, feel footsteps in the floorboards. The house hummed in agreement, its timbers creaking as if exhaling. Bram walked to the hearth, pawed once at the floor, and then looked up at him expectantly. "You think it's time?" Elias asked. The dog blinked, slow, steady, certain. Elias took the key from the mantel, its brass glinting faintly. The key had opened one door already, the one beneath the cabin, but maybe it had another purpose. He turned it in his palm, feeling the edges worn smooth from years of use. Somewhere, perhaps outside another door, waited another truth his grandfather had left unfinished. But that would come later. For now, he simply wanted to sit and let the meaning settle. The following morning came sharp and bright, the kind of autumn light that burned through fog and exposed every detail the dark had tried to hide. Elias stood on the porch, with his coffee, staring at the photograph he held in his hand. The men in the picture seemed to stare back, their expressions both weary and proud. He'd memorized every face, every crease, every shadow of bravery that still lingered there. He could no longer sit still in the silence of the cabin. He needed to know what the world remembered about the place his grandfather had called home. Maybe someone else still carried pieces of the story that had nearly been forgotten. Bram watched him from the steps, tail sweeping the boards once before he rose, ready to follow. The road down the mountain was long and winding, but the truck knew it by heart, as if memory itself had carved the way. The old town sat in the valley below, half forgotten by progress. Elias parked near a weathered church, with white paint peeling off its steeple, the bell silent but steady. Across from it stood a small general store with a hand-painted sign that simply read Abernathy's. He pushed open the door and was greeted by the faint smell of flour tobacco and something sweeter, molasses maybe. Behind the counter stood a woman whose hair was more silver than white, her back straight as a pine. She looked up from her newspaper, her sharp blue eyes softening the instant they found him. "You've got the Ward face," she said before he could speak. "You're Henry's grandson." The words hit him like a benediction. "Yes, ma'am," he answered quietly. "Elias Ward." Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Well, I'll be. It's been near 50 years since anyone from that line came down off the ridge, and what brings you here, son?" He hesitated, unsure how to explain the truth that had unfolded in that old cabin. "I found something," he said finally. "Something my grandfather left behind. Letters, a photograph. It led me to believe he helped people during the war, hid them." Her gaze sharpened. "You found the Lord's door, then?" The name hung in the air like smoke, old and sacred. Elias felt chills rise along his arms. "You know about it?" he asked. She nodded slowly, setting her paper aside. "Honey, everyone who lived through those years knew about that place, even if we never said it out loud. Your granddaddy was a brave man, a fool to some, a saint to others. He called that cabin the Lord's door because he said when one door closes on a man, God opens another. He believed his was that door." Elias exhaled the truth, settling heavier and more beautiful than he expected. "Did you ever see it yourself?" when she said, her voice softening. "My daddy was one of the men he hid. I was just a girl, but I remember the night Henry Ward came to our house, said we needed to pack and move quick. He led us up the mountain in the rain, barefoot half the way. He carried me when I fell, told me not to be afraid, said the dogs knew the path even in the dark." Her eyes grew distant, her hands trembling just slightly as memory surfaced. "Your granddaddy's shepherd, Big One, all black and tan, stood watch the whole night. I'll never forget the way he stared into the trees, like he could see danger before it came." Elias felt his throat tighten. "That dog," he said, almost whispering his name, "wasn't Harlan, was it?" She blinked, surprised. "Well, yes, it was. You know about him? Elias nodded, his voice thick. I found his collar under the floorboards. She smiled faintly. That collar was sacred. Henry buried it himself after Harlan died. Said the mountain would keep his spirit until it was needed again. Her words sank into him like a revelation. Do you still have anything from those days? He asked. Miss Doretta disappeared behind the counter, returning with a small tin box wrapped in a faded handkerchief. She opened it gently, revealing an old dog tag dull with age. Your granddaddy gave this to my daddy when we left that cabin. Said it belonged to the unit that trained his dog before the war. He told him to keep it as proof that courage comes in all shapes. Some walk on 4 legs. She placed the tag in Elias's hand. The engraving was faint but readable US K9 Unit 9. The metal was cool and heavy, carrying a weight far larger than its size. He swallowed hard, his chest tight. He never told anyone, did he asked, quietly. He didn't need to, she said. That man didn't save people for the sake of history. He did it because it was right. Elias nodded, unable to find words. Miss Doretta studied him for a moment, her eyes glistening. You've got his steadiness about you, but also his sorrow. You carry something heavy, don't you? He gave a small, weary smile, trying to learn what to do with what he left me. Then listen to the mountain, she said. It'll tell you. When Elias stepped outside, Bram was waiting beside the truck tail, thumping slowly against the dirt. The dog looked up at him expectantly, as if he had known exactly what Elias would return with. Elias crouched down and held out the dog tag. See this, he said, voice low. Your people wore this long before I ever did. Bram sniffed the metal once, then licked it, the gesture so deliberate that Elias froze. For a brief second, the air shifted warm and still. A breeze swept through the pines beyond the town, carrying the faint smell of rain and wood smoke. Bram turned, trotting toward the edge of the street, looking back every few steps as though urging him home. Elias followed, his boots echoing softly on the gravel. The drive back up the mountain felt lighter than before, though his heart was heavier with meaning. Every turn of the road whispered reminders of what he now knew, that courage could live quietly for generations, waiting to be found again. When the cabin came into view, bathed in the golden light of afternoon, Bram jumped from the truck before it even stopped. He ran straight to the porch and sat down facing the valley, head hightail still. Elias joined him, holding the tag in his palm. He whispered, You knew all along, didn't you? The weather turned without warning that night. Elias had been sitting by the fire, reading through his grandfather's letter again, while the mountain outside disappeared under a rising fog. The warmth in the cabin had felt comforting until Bram lifted his head from the rug, ears twitching, eyes narrowing toward the door. The first rumble came a moment later, a deep growl that rolled through the valley. Thunder followed, quick bouncing off the ridges like the echo of something old waking up. Elias stood, walked to the window, and saw the tree line bending under a wind that looked alive. Looks like we're in for it, he murmured, closing the shutters. The storm arrived fast and violent, the kind that belonged to the mountains. Rain slashed against the windows, the roof groaning under the wind's weight. Lightning cracked across the ridge, revealing for an instant the dark outline of the forest below. And Elias thought he saw figures there, shadows that disappeared as soon as the light faded. He shook his head in blaming exhaustion, but the feeling didn't leave. The air in the cabin grew heavy, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat that used to live beneath the floor. Bram started pacing his claws, clicking fast against the boards. He barked once sharp and urgent, then ran to the trapdoor near the hearth and began scratching harder than before. Not now, Boy Elias said, trying to calm him. But the dog wouldn't stop. He was desperate, whining and clawing until splinters flew. Lightning flared again, illuminating the collar key photograph and tag on the mantel. The metal of the dog tag shimmered, catching the flash like it was alive. The thunder that followed shook the walls so hard the Bible fell open on its stand, its pages fluttering to Psalm 91 again. Elias froze the verse, glowing faintly in the firelight. He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust. Another clap of thunder boomed closer this time, rattling the floorboards under his boots. Bram barked again, pressing his nose to the seam of the trap door. Something was happening below. Elias crouched and placed his hand on the wood. It was cold, so cold it burned. He felt movement beneath a vibration like footsteps or distant breathing. Then came a whisper so faint he thought it might have been the wind until it formed words. Open. He jerked back, heart racing, staring at the floor. The air smelled of rain and iron. Another flash of lightning and the lights flickered, dimming the fire to embers. The wind outside screamed and the mountain seemed to groan under its weight. Bram barked louder, his fur standing on end, every muscle tight. Elias gritted his teeth, grabbed the crowbar and forced the trapdoor open. A rush of cold air burst upwards, slamming into him like a living thing. The fire went out, plunging the room into near darkness, except for the weak beam of his flashlight. The air that poured from below wasn't just cold. It carried scent and sound, faint traces of smoke, gunpowder, sweat, and something else voices. They rose and fell like a hymn, distant yet distinct, the rhythm of men praying in fear. Elias's breath caught. The sound filled the cabin, mixing with the thunder and rain. Bram stood at the edge of the opening, tail down, but unflinching, staring into the void with quiet recognition. You hear that too, don't you? Elias whispered. The dog didn't move. The voices grew stronger, layered, as though echoing from decades ago. He could make out fragments. Deliver us. Keep us safe. Don't let them find us. Each plea hit him like a blow. He knew those words. They were the prayers carved into the stone wall downstairs. The same hands that had written, "If you're reading this, we made it," had once begged for survival in this darkness. Lightning flashed again, and Elias swore he saw faint figures below, men crouched together in the cellar, huddled with fear and faith, their eyes wide, their mouths moving in prayer. The storm howled outside, thunder pounding in rhythm with the voices. He stumbled back, overwhelmed by the sound and memory bleeding together, but Bram didn't move. The shepherd began to descend the stairs, one careful step at a time, as though following an invisible command. Bram knew Elias shouted, but the dog ignored him, disappearing into the dark below. Elias hesitated only a second before following his flashlight, trembling in his grip. The beam cut through the cold air, revealing the room below alive with shifting shadows. The cot frames rattled the Bible's pages, flapping though no wind touched them. Bram stood in the center, perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the wall where the names were carved. Elias stepped beside him, and then the voices stopped. Silence deep and sudden. Only the storm remained above, muted now like a distant drum. Elias's flashlight flickered once, twice, and died. The darkness swallowed them whole. Then came a light, not from his hand, but from the wall itself, a soft golden glow seeping from the carvings, each letter shining faintly. The air filled with warmth, and in that moment, Elias wasn't afraid. He felt presence all around him, strong and familiar. A voice rose from the stillness, not loud, but clear, warm, as his grandfather's laugh. "You kept it open, boy. You did what I couldn't." Elias's throat closed. "Grandpa." The name came out as a whisper broken by disbelief. The light brightened, painting the chamber walls in shades of gold and white. He could see the outlines of men standing behind the glow. Not ghosts, but memories made flesh by gratitude. The morning after the storm broke quiet and strangely clean, the air washed free of dust and sorrow. The sunlight stretched across the valley, sharp and gold glinting off leaves still wet with last night's rain. Elias stepped out onto the porch, coffee in one hand, the other resting absently on the dog at his side. Bram's head leaned against his thigh, heavier than usual, his breathing uneven. The shepherd had been moving slower for weeks, but after the storm he seemed older, his step stiff, his tail dragging like a tired banner. Elias had hoped the mountain air would heal him, but healing doesn't always mean staying. The dog looked up, eyes cloudy, but kind as though he understood the truth that Elias wasn't ready to face. "You did good, old boy," Elias said softly. "You kept them safe." Bram blinked tail, thumping weakly once. When they went back inside, the cabin felt different again, softer around the edges, as though the ghosts from the storm had settled finally into peace. The photograph on the mantel no longer looked haunted by time. It glowed faintly in the sunbeam breaking through the window. The carved words below the hearth. "If you're reading this, we made it felt truer than ever." Elias poured himself another cup of coffee, sat beside Bram, and watched the fire grow. He'd rebuilt it the night before after sealing the trap door again using the last of the old pine logs from the pile his grandfather had left. The smell filled the room, earthy and sweet, like memory turned into smoke. Bram lay near the fire, his chest rising slower now. When the flames crackled, he lifted his head, watching them dance. The faint reflection of the fire shimmered in his eyes, golden and distant, as if he were watching another world through it. Elias reached down and scratched behind his ears, feeling the bones sharp under his fur. "You rest now," he whispered. "You've been carrying this mountain longer than any of us." The sound of the wind outside was low and steady, almost a hum, and it reminded him of the heartbeat he'd once felt under the floor. He wondered if the same pulse had lived in Bram all along. The dog shifted, pressing his paw lightly against Elias's boot. His breathing hitched. That soft, shallow rasp hit something deep inside Elias, a place beyond words. He knelt beside him, spreading the old army blanket, the one from the cellar, the one that had covered the cots of the men who hid there. It still smelled faintly of cedar and earth. Bram's body sank into it, his tail twitching once. Elias brushed a hand down his side, feeling each rib move beneath the fur. He remembered the words Miss Doretta had said, "Listen to the mountain." The mountain, he realized now, wasn't outside. It lived in the quiet courage of those who endured. It lived in his grandfather's hands, in the prayers of men who carved hope into stone, and in the loyal heart of the dog who kept their memory alive. Bram's eyes closed halfway, then opened again. He stared at Elias, and for a brief moment, Elias saw the reflection of that old photograph, the men standing proud, his grandfather's calm face, and beside them, the shepherd who looked just like Bram. He whispered, "You're part of them, aren't you? You never stopped guarding this place." The dog didn't move, but something about the way his gaze softened told Elias he understood. The room grew still, even the fire settling to a quiet glow. The clock on the mantel had stopped ticking sometime in the night, but the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. Elias pressed his hand to Bram's chest, feeling the faint thud of his heart, a rhythm fragile but steady. He stayed like that for a long time, just listening. Outside, thunder murmured one last time beyond the ridge, a faraway echo of the storm that had come and gone. The air thickened with that strange, holy quiet that comes right before goodbye. Bram's breathing slowed again, each exhale softer, lighter, until Elias could barely feel it beneath his fingers. The dog shifted slightly, then rested his paw gently over Elias's hand, the weight of it deliberate and tender. Elias froze, his throat closing around a grief too heavy to name. Lightning flashed outside the window, a single burst that painted the cabin in white for half a heartbeat. Then came silence. No thunder followed, no wind, no rain, just a stillness so complete it pressed against the walls. The fire made one last pop, sending a small ember drifting into the air before fading to ash. Elias bowed his head, his forehead resting on Bram's paw. He didn't cry right away. The grief was too large for tears. At first, it was an ache that filled every corner of the room, every breath of the mountain. When the first tear finally fell, it landed on Bram's fur, sliding down into the old army blanket that had once kept strangers alive. "You can rest now," Elias whispered. "You kept your promise." He stayed there through the afternoon, long after the fire had died out, long after the light shifted across the floor. When he finally stood, he was trembling, but the heaviness in his chest had changed shape. It was no longer the kind that crushed. It was the kind that carried. He wrapped Bram in the blanket gently, the same way his grandfather might have wrapped the bodies of those he'd saved when the world above wasn't ready for them. He carried the dog outside to the oak tree that stood at the edge of the clearing. The ground there was soft from the rain. He dug until his palms bled the soil rich and dark. He laid Bram down with a collar around his neck and the tag from Unit 9 resting on his chest. "You were never just a dog," Elias said softly. "You were history that refused to die." The morning after the burial dawned slow, gray, and still. The kind of silence that doesn't just fall over a place, but sinks into it. Elias sat on the porch with his hands wrapped around a cup, gone cold, watching mist weave through the pines like smoke from a ghost fire. The mound of earth beneath the oak stood fresh and dark, the army blanket folded neatly beside it, the brass key gleaming faintly where he had tied it to Bram's collar before covering him with soil. He'd stood there for a long time the night before, palm pressed to the earth, whispering words he didn't remember saying. Now, in the pale morning, the memory of that last breath still clung to him like the fog. The mountain seemed quieter than usual, as though mourning with him. Even the birds had gone still. He took a long breath and let it out slowly, the air sharp in his lungs. "You're free now, boy," he said quietly. The words felt strange, half blessing, half surrender. The cabin behind him creaked softly in the wind, the wood swelling with moisture from the storm. When he turned back toward it for the first time in days, he saw no light in the windows, no pulse from the hearth. The house looked asleep. Inside, it was colder than he expected. He lit a fire, fed it until the warmth returned, then sat by the hearth with the photograph in his lap. The men in the picture seemed more real than ever, the outlines of their faces clearer now that the dust had been wiped away. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "He's gone." The sound of his own voice in the quiet startled him. He set the photograph down and poured a small measure of whiskey into a tin cup, raising it toward the mantel. "For you, Grandpa. For him. For all of you." He drank the liquid, burning down like memory turned to fire. The rain had stopped, but the roof still dripped rhythmically, the sound steady as breath. Hours passed. He busied himself with small things, chopping wood, patching a loose shutter, oiling the hinges on the door. But the cabin refused to let him escape its quiet. By afternoon, a soft wind had picked up, warm and strange for the season, curling through the open window like a whisper. It carried the faint smell of wet soil and pine needles, the smell of Bram. Elias froze the axe handle slipping slightly in his hand. He turned toward the cabin, half expecting to see the dog stretched out on the hearth as before. But of course there was nothing there, only the shadows flickering against the wall. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted. "You're losing it," he muttered. But when he went back inside, something had changed. The air felt charged, not haunting, but aware, like the heartbeat returning beneath the floor. He knelt beside the trap door, his hand hovering over the seam. The last time he'd opened it, a storm had answered. Now, only silence. Yet beneath that silence came another sound, faint but real, a single soft scrape, like claws against wood. Elias's breath hitched. He waited, heart pounding. The sound came again, rhythmic this time, not frantic, not desperate, just steady, patient. He closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. Bram. The name fell into the air and hung there. Another scratch answered, followed by a brief pause, then two quick taps, just like the dog's tail against the floor when he used to lie beside the fire. Elias felt tears sting his eyes. He pressed his hand flat to the floor. "You're home, boy," he whispered. The warmth came back then, not from the fire, not from the air, but from the boards themselves. The heartbeat he'd felt on his first night here returned slow and strong. Only now he knew whose it was. It wasn't the mountains. It wasn't the cabins. It was Bram's, the loyal heart that had kept watch long after its body was gone, Elias leaned forward, forehead resting on the wood, and for the first time, grief didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a bridge. He stayed there until the sun dipped behind the ridge, the firelight deepening around him. The shadows danced across the walls like memory moving through time. Then from beneath the floor, a single bark echoed, not loud, not frightening, but familiar. Elias froze, then smiled through the tears spilling freely now. "Rest easy," he whispered. The scratching stopped. The cabin settled. The wind outside shifted, brushing through the trees in slow, mournful sighs. Elias rose and walked to the window. The world below glowed gold in the fading light. The oak tree stood tall and unmoving, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw a shape sitting beside it, a faint outline of a dog head, high facing the valley. When he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the wind stirring the grass. He turned back to the cabin, his gaze falling on the mantel where the key used to rest. The space where it had been seemed to shimmer faintly in the firelight, as though some unseen hand had touched it. He smiled, whispering, "You took it with you, huh?" The floor gave a soft, almost amused creak beneath his feet, and Elias laughed quietly. It wasn't grief anymore. It was gratitude. He poured another cup of whiskey, raised it to the air, and said, "To every guardian, 2 legs, 4 legs, or otherwise." The fire popped in answer. That night, sleep came easy for the first time in years. The cabin hummed softly, a lullaby of wind and wood and faith. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of barking rolled down the ridge, carried on the night air, not haunting, but steady protective. Elias dreamed of the oak tree and the soldiers who once knelt beneath it. He dreamed of his grandfather standing beside them, hand resting on the head of a shepherd, saying, "Good boy, watch over them." When he woke near dawn, the air smelled like rain and warmth again. He pressed his hand to the floor just once, and the faint heartbeat answered. He smiled through tears, whispering, "Still here." Winter rolled down the mountain, slow and gentle, the way time does when it knows it's carrying something sacred. Elias stayed, though part of him had thought he might leave after burying Bram. But every time he packed his truck or folded his clothes, the mountain spoke through the wind, whispering the same quiet truth: there was still work to do. So he remained. The cabin needed repairs. The roof sagged under old weight. The porch leaned like an exhausted old man, and the walls bore the scars of time. But Elias rebuilt it with the same patient hands that once carved beauty from rough timber. Each nail driven was an act of memory. Each plank replaced a prayer. He didn't paint over the carvings or patch the marks on the hearth. He left them visible reminders that the past didn't need covering. It only needed honoring. When the work was done, he stood outside, breathing in the scent of sawdust and pine. The cabin looked reborn, not new, but alive. The sign he'd carved by the gate read, "The Guardian's Rest." The words felt right. It wasn't a museum, not a memorial, it was a promise. The door, his grandfather's door, would stay open for anyone who needed warmth, shelter, or peace. That winter, word spread through the valley. Veterans passing through found their way up the ridge, some broken, some quiet, some simply tired. Elias didn't ask questions. He gave them coffee stew and silence, the kind that healed. Some stayed a night, some a week. A few never left. They helped him chop wood patch fences, tend the garden that now grew behind the cabin where the ground had once been hollow with hiding. One of them, a quiet man named Lewis, who'd served in Iraq, found the hidden room beneath the floor and stood there for hours reading the carved words until tears streaked his face. When he came up, he just said, "I felt them down there." Elias nodded. We all do. As the months passed, the mountain became a place of refuge again, just as it had been in his grandfather's time. The old Bible stayed open on the table, Psalm 91, catching sunlight each morning. The photograph, collar, dog tag, and key all hung together above the mantel, the 4 pieces glowing like a compass for the lost. And beside them stood a new addition, a wooden carving of Bram life-sized facing east, as if forever watching for dawn. Elias had carved it himself, every stroke of the knife, deliberate, every curve filled with memory. When he finished, he placed it on the porch. The shepherd's posture was calm, noble, patient. "There," Elias said aloud, smiling. "You can keep guard from here." The wind rustled through the trees, soft and approving. He began to sleep better after that. The nightmares that used to follow him from his mother's death, his father's silence, and years of running from the past began to fade. In their place came dreams of the cabin glowing with laughter, the kind he used to imagine when his grandfather told him bedtime stories by the fire. The mountain stopped being a reminder of grief and became a living thing, a home that carried its own heartbeat, one that now matched his. One morning in early spring, Elias woke before sunrise. The valley was still covered in mist, the air cool enough to see his breath. He poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, setting one on the porch rail where Bram used to sit. "Old habits," he muttered, smiling. As he sat, a sound caught his ear, the faint crunch of gravel down the path. He turned. From the curve of the road came a shape limping slowly toward the porch. A dog, thin and dirty, its fur matted, one ear torn, its gait uneven, but determined. It stopped a few feet from the steps, watching him with wary eyes. Elias's heart clenched. He set his cup down and knelt. "Hey there, traveler," he said softly. "You lost." The dog didn't move. It sniffed the air, head tilted slightly, then looked toward the carved figure of Bram. Something changed in its stance, then its tail lifted, and it took one cautious step forward, then another, until it reached the porch. Elias extended his hand. The dog sniffed his fingers, then pressed its head into his palm, trembling. The warmth of it brought tears to his eyes. "Welcome home," he whispered. He opened the cabin door, and the dog limped inside without hesitation, circling the hearth once before lying down, right on the spot where Bram used to sleep. The fire crackled, and the light fell across its fur, revealing faint patches of tan under the dirt. Elias smiled through the blur of tears. "You're one of his, aren't you?" The wind outside shifted, humming low through the eaves, and for a second he heard it again. The soft thump of a tail against wood, the echo of claws on the floorboards, and somewhere beneath it, all the steady, faithful heartbeat of the house. He sat down in the old chair by the fire, the same one his grandfather had built, and felt peace spread through him like warmth. The cabin glowed in the morning light, the walls alive with every story it had held, those who prayed in its shadows, those who listened in its silence, and those who found their way back when the world turned cold. The mountain outside breathed steady and sure, and Elias realized something simple and profound. Some doors once opened never close. They change shape, they change time, but their purpose stays the same, to offer shelter to those who still believe in kindness. He looked towards the carved dog on the porch and whispered, "We did it, boy." The wind answered with a long sigh through the chimney, carrying the smell of rain and earth. He reached down and patted the new dog who stirred but didn't wake. "Rest easy, you're safe now." The fire popped once, sending a spark up the chimney and into the sky. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the valley with gold. The porch boards creaked the carving of Bram, catching the first light, its eyes gleaming briefly as if alive. Elias smiled, his heart full. The mountain had remembered the cabin had healed, and the promise had endured. Some stories didn't end. They simply kept breathing through those willing to listen. The end. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like and subscribe so more people can discover it. Tell me in the comments what part of the story moved you most. Was it the cabin, the storm, or Bram's final goodbye? And let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel.